Hi, so this is a mental day for me. I get to interview one of my favourite mastering engineers and someone who's worked on so much music that I absolutely adore. So my first question for Mandy is, how would you define mastering?
How would I define mastering? I was taught we were the first objective set of ears onto the project. That was our first role. Our second role was to transfer the audio to whatever medium it needed to go to. So when I started in mastering, it was very much reel to disc. And of course, back then, most of, well, nigh on all, apart from a few of the projects that came in, were done in professional studios. So we were taught that we needed to keep the integrity of the mix, very much so. So you tried to do as little as possible to the mix. The adjustments that you made were more in line with transferring it onto vinyl and the problems that might entail. Then, with the onslaught of CD mastering, when CD mastering started, the CD master was a secondary thought, and we would still prioritise the vinyl, and we would transfer the tape with the same settings that were on the vinyl for the first, onto the CD master. But really, for me, my role in the production team is an objective set of ears, and to open up questions, if any come up, which nowadays, because of bedroom production and lots of people mixing on small monitors and not having control of bass, I seem to have to do a lot, ask lots of questions, maybe get into stem mastering with them if they are not capable of fixing it themselves. Getting them to go back and remix. But when I started, it was very much a principle of just transferring and keeping the integrity of the mix. But now I seem to, be more involved with the production, with the sounds than doing that role so much.
Okay, so when you first get some music to master, what's the first thing you do?
I generally sit on my sofa with a cup of coffee and don't really listen to it. I put it on and just have it on in the background. If the clients are with me, it's generally a time for them to adjust their ears into my room. It's a time for them to give me the story, for us to discuss what ideas they're looking for. Even if it's unattended, I still sit on the sofa and will listen to it that way. Because often when I'm not engaged, sitting at my board, if things feel wrong, I can make a note of it. I find when I've worked at other studios, and the role model was to basically start working very quickly because, we were sort of banging work out, so to speak, you tended to do a lot more. To the stuff, because I was engaged. I was sitting at the desk and I was engaged as an engineer rather than listening. So that's, I start by just generally sitting on the sofa and just listening. Sometimes I might play it more than once, if I'm not sure, I've got different ideas coming up. Every session's different, but I always start by just listening in a relaxed environment rather than engaged.
Okay, some people see mastering as like purely technical rather than creative. What do you reckon to that?
No, we're a creative process, especially now compared to when I started, I suppose. No, but even when I started, every teacher of mine had a very unique approach and style. So we're all creative because it's based on our ear sets at that moment in time. So even if we are looking at it just from a transfer point of view, we're still making creative choices when it comes to the music. But I suppose now, as mastering engineers, we're doing a lot more, stem mastering, getting involved in, final stage of mixing. We're a lot more hand-holding with the production team, be it a good or a bad thing. That's really what we're doing.
Okay, you often get involved in the final stages of mixing. What are the challenges involved in that?
It's a different processing, really, because you're you're approaching in the sense of finishing the mix, and then sort of you're jumping brains really from, you know, the sort of mix side, artistic side on the mix, coming into, you know, the mastering. I try and sort of not think about the mastering too much, and then worry about that when I've got the mix sounding where it should. Generally, then when I take it to mastering, I don't have to do too much. But yeah, I'll get involved in projects sometimes halfway through the project, with some production teams, listening to mixes and bringing my ear set at that point. You know, maybe going to a studio, they might send me some stuff. Generally, if I can get to the studio, I will. I like to hear it the way they're hearing it, because it's easier to give them ideas. But yeah, every project's different. Yeah. And generally, that's clients that have the luxury of having a bit of budget. Mm? Okay.
So speaking of budget, how did you learn the business side of mastering?
I worked at the Exchange, and the model there was pretty tight on the way they charge things. And so I learned a lot there. You know, both my bosses, John and Graham, were, you know, very open to sharing information, and especially when Graham took the Exchange over, we were all very involved in the decisions of the Exchange. So yeah, I think I learned a lot of my ethos from there, you know, my approach. It's changed a lot. Back then we had a lot more, well, we did have, you know, producers coming in. And record companies, we didn't really deal with management. I find dealing with the management side of artists a nightmare. They're the ones that don't like paying. Yeah, everyone else, they seem to pay. They're pretty on the level. But I've had quite a few managers where, you know, it has to, you know, get into knocking heads to get the money out of them, which has made me change my model a lot. So if management's coming to me, you know, they need to pay me up front. They don't get credit. Mm-hmm.
How do you go about keeping things professional?
The problem we have now, people are doing things too cheap, especially in the UK. If we start looking around the world, especially if we look over at America, they're charging a lot more money than us. So this model of charging per track, I'm not going to charge per track, you know, because who knows what I'm going to get delivered and, you know, what I'm going to have to deal with. I have a rough idea of how long it should take me to do stuff, but I read, yeah, this £35 to master a track. There's no point in me switching my room on. There really isn't. You know, I've got secure internet. You know, the insurances that I have to have, especially working with famous artists that are coming in the building. I mean, my overheads are really expensive. So the thing is, if you start cheap, it's really hard to put your prices up. You know, if you start and charge the going rates that people are charging, it's really easy to cut deals, you know, with people. You know, if they come back and go, I can't afford you, or, you know, they don't email you back, you can follow it up. And you can always bring money down in between people and offer to do it for cheaper. But if your starting place is really low, it's really hard to bring it up. The problem we're having in this country, we've got Grammy award-winning mix engineers that are incredible, that should be charging, you know, at least £2,000 a mix, that are charging £250, and they're desperate because they've got overheads and they've got bills. And this is because of the model of students coming out of the universities and not charging. You know, they've got the luxury of being maybe at home in a bedroom. You know, the parents are paying all the bills. They haven't got a clue what real life is really like. So I really try and encourage, keep it professional, or always charge for your work. I say the same with, you know, mix engineers when I'm lecturing them, is have a fair trade. You know, I've studied in healing, you know, often you don't want to charge money for healing. It's like a really wrong thing, but, you know, there should be an exchange. There should always be an exchange. So if the band haven't got budget, I had one artist who didn't have any money, but he knew how to build websites. So he built a website for me. I mastered his album. Fair exchange. You wouldn't expect a plumber to come and, you know, fix your leak and, you know, not pay him, you know. He's going to get paid, you know. We should get paid. This free model that we're into, I just see where we're heading. The industry is going to be more like a hobby than a professional industry. So we need to fight for our rights. We've studied a long time.
How important is a good client relationship to you?
Yeah, it's very important, you know, that's the crutch of where I earn my money, you know. I suppose I'm really blessed. I'm not the go-to mastering engineer from record companies. I'm very much producer, artists will find me. Very much word of mouth. I've been blessed that I haven't had to advertise, you know, ever. You know, when we were at the Exchange, it was an ethos of the Exchange not to advertise. So I've been very blessed with that. So I have long-term relationships with so many of my clients. It's quite, you know, I'm so busy, it's quite hard when some of these guys come up and want something. I had a phone call yesterday from a producer that's got 2 projects coming up, and it's a bit like, okay, you know, let's see what we can do. But I've worked with him for, I don't know, 20 years. So I'm not going to say no to him. To him, I'm part of his sound. We grew up together, we developed his sound together.
Okay. Have you made a conscious effort to do work in certain genres? Do you prefer working with certain genres, or do you like the appeal of doing a bit of everything?
I was really lucky when I was at the Exchange that I didn't get pigeonholed. So many of the engineers there really got pigeonholed into specific genres of music. And I was the go-to for anything else. I mean, I did do a lot of breakbeat stuff. I was known for breakbeat. I was known for a lot of the house stuff would come to me. But no, I'd get the classical stuff. I'd get the indie. I'd get the rock. I'd get the experimental, because the other guys didn't really understand it, but it was music that I listened to personally growing up. So yeah. I was lucky. So I work from, I say classical to punk. I work on all genres.
Okay, cool. How has your approach to mastering changed over those years?
I suppose the first stages hasn't changed. You know, the objective set of ears. And still having the ethos that I'm a transfer engineer. But I think I have to be a lot more of a doctor now. I do a lot more EQ than I've ever done past in my career, you know, but mainly to sort of make something up there. Often, you know, you're getting people that are mixing on small monitors that aren't set up very well, maybe headphones, and the mixes sound very here and very thin, you know. So you need to do a lot to get it to come out and get big. And, you know.
Do you sometimes have to educate your clients?
Yes, a lot.
Yeah.
A lot more. It costs a lot of time. So I do with some of the younger producers. We will sort of mentor them through, you know, sort of 2-3 years, you know, and I'll say to them right at the beginning of the session, just pick a master engineer, stick with them for a couple of years, because you will learn your mixing. It doesn't have to be me. Go, you know, just find a master engineer and just stick for a couple of years and keep throwing your mixes, because then you're going to learn your trade and you're going to build. If you keep, you know, I had one guy that just went everywhere, and he had money and he went to all the top guys, and he ended up back at me about a year later and was still not happy with any of the mastering he was getting. I said, but look what you're doing. You're going to all these different ears. We're not the same, and we're all going to approach what you're doing differently. You're not learning your trade. Okay,
cool. I asked on Twitter and Instagram if anyone had any questions for you, because I thought mine are all going to be about learning, because I'm learning. So someone called Mitch St. Amour has asked about your favourite digital EQ for carving.
All right, so here's the thing. I was just in Berlin with Red Bull Music Academy and did a workshop, and I got asked the same question, more about subtractive EQ. And of course, you've got to remember, I grew up in an area where it was tape, it was about transferring, keeping the integrity. And they asked about frequencies that were resonating in the mix. And I played a track that I'd mastered that had this resonance on one note in the bass. And I hate subtractive EQ. I will use it if I really have to fix something, but I can hear it across every frequency, so it just really upsets me. You know, it makes me sort of click my head around, and I get very upset. I hear it in the vocal, I hear it across everything. So they were really shocked when I played the mastered version, because all I'd done was added EQ around. So I'll add EQ around to balance out the resonant frequency. And they couldn't hear this resonance anymore, and they were just fascinated. But that was, how I was taught to approach things, what I learn't from all my teachers in a sense, because I've had many, Sean being one of them. So yeah, I suppose EQ, I'll just use whatever's there. I'm really sort of funny when it comes to tools, I've got a great studio, I've got great bespoke equipment, I've got, great old equipment. But I really will use whatever, so I'll just try different things. It really doesn't matter to me, Sometimes I'll do it just in Sadie. If I'm trying to doctor something and I want to do it before the mix, I might use a plug-in. I don't know, Fab Filter stuff I might use. I like some of the Stephen Slate stuff. I like some of the, Sequoia EQ stuff, but generally, I don't use a lot of digital, to be honest with you. It really, I might do at the end of the chain, I might use some stuff. It varies job to job, but I haven't got a favourite go-to. It's the same with my setup. I'll unplug things, plug them in. To me, every job's different. I'll listen to it, without going through anything, and just make a decision from there. I think the thing is about the more experience you gain, especially with your tools, it makes it easier for you to make the decisions of what you're going to go to.
Okay, so the next question is from someone called Engine Ears with a Z on Twitter. Don't laugh.
I love it.
How did you acquire your transfer console?
Sean helped me. Sean helped me,
yeah.
Yes. I was working at Electric, and of course I'd come from the exchange where we didn't have desks. We had like a passive fader in the desk, to do fades for the cut, and we used to plug equipment in as we needed it, which was a real nightmare when you had a session that was attended, that was a cut, and then you had to go to digital mastering because you had to repatch everything. And it was just very stressful, especially if you were pushing clock. So I'd never had the luxury of working on a mastering desk. So I went to Electric, who had the MI transfer console, and we had quite a to-do. Sean will probably remember when I got there and how upset I was by the other engineers of how they'd installed the setup, and how I had to get Sean down to come and help me, and how the monitors were wrong, and Sean. So he said to me one day when he was down looking at the lathe with us, how are you getting on with the desk? And I was like, oh my God, I'm in love. And he said, I've got a friend who's got one, so let me see whether he's interested. It's in storage, whether he's interested in selling it. So I went and met Sean's friend and had an evening with him. And I couldn't try out the desk, because it was in a warehouse and it wasn't plugged in, and it had a sheet over it. And I called Sean the next day and I said, well, I'm interested, but I couldn't check it, Sean. I couldn't hear it. And Sean just went, trust me, if you want it, everything will be fine. So we done the deal, the desk came, and Sean came over and we plugged it in, and hey presto, off we went.
Amazing. So I have another question from Twitter from 1026 Mastering, and they're asking what things you would take into consideration when mastering for VR.
Okay, do any of you know about how VR works, how VR audio works, sort of? And I might need your help soon. Okay, so with VR audio, it's working over the gaming engine. So it's not a mix, it's not like we know a mix, it's not static, you don't bounce a mix. The mix is happening in real time over the engine. Now the problem we had with the couple of pieces that we did for VR was that the people that had done the film, like all filmmakers, don't really give a shit about the audio. So what was happening, the film was going, but they hadn't put things in the programming to help us keep the audio synced. And of course, what happens, what we would do, I don't know whether it's changed now, but what was happening then was if the processor was slowing down because of the video, the audio would start jittering. Now, of course, in a game, that doesn't really matter. You can sort of get away with it because of spot sounds. It's not complex audio. It's not a music track. With us, of course, it was causing us a big problem. So we had to go in and sort of reprogram stuff, and it cost a lot of time and a lot of energy. So that was one thing. When it comes to mastering, if you think about it, the mix is happening real time. You're not sort of, you can't master the whole mix because it isn't a mix, you know, it's just pieces of audio. So you can't master all the audio. There was a great example yesterday of that, of, you know, like with stems, for instance, you know, you do different things to stems and then put it together and it might not come together. Same thing happens with the VR audio. So we had to make a lot of choices about what elements we were going to master. And really hard when you're working with an artist whose brief is it needs to sound like the stereo record. Great, you know.
Wow.
It was, it was a tough feat. And then the other side of it, the loudness. You know, you cannot, you know, if it spot sounds like a gun and they've just got like a stereo bed of, you know, ambient music playing underneath or just music coming up now and then, it's not, you know, a sort of 6-minute track. That's got, you know, some of these mixes. I mean, on one track, we got sent 2 whole Pro Tools sessions full of stems, you know, that we needed to, you know, try and put together. And of course, in VR, we don't want stereo beds, you know, because we're talking about, you know, we can do whatever we want. We don't necessarily want to be putting just, you know, stereo stuff like this, you know, to get something to sound real and nice. So, you know, it was a interesting thing, but the level thing was the hardest thing, you know, because you're coming out of this headphone on the gaming console and you just couldn't get the level out of it. And of course, you know, if, you know, the brief was, this was for an art exhibition and we were using B&W headphones, which were incredible, but not great in an exhibition environment. And yeah, really hard to get this stuff to go through. And it's going to be interesting going forward how we're going to deal with that. You know, and again, you're dealing with, you know, artist producer that is used to the stereo and it being very loud. So trying to sort of come up with different ways of limiting, you know, sort of stuff. But again, you don't want to limit the whole thing because you want this space so that you've got this movement so it feels natural. And what elements are we going to limit to push up and bring up, you know, to give the impression of loudness? It was an interesting project.
Wow, that's amazing. My mind's a bit blown right now.
Yeah. Mine hurts just thinking about it.
So the next question is from Daniel Liam Glynn on Twitter. His question is, what's your favourite project you've worked on? Do you have one?
No.
Okay.
I don't. Again, my ethos is that, you know, it's really weird, you know, because I work on so many different projects, but my ethos with it is any artist, producer approaching me to work on a record, I need to be really humbled by that. You know, they're bringing their life's work. Be it that they've only spent a couple of weeks doing it, being that they've spent 10 years doing it, it's their most precious thing. So therefore, I need to think of it as my most precious thing. So if it's my most precious thing, then I'm going to do the best I can for it. So no favourites. Often the ones that I remember through my career, I mean, you know, I do have favourites that I just think are amazing sort of pieces of work that I would maybe listen to in my personal life. Some of them I do. But often the ones you remember are the ones that were a nightmare, you know, because you do so much. I mean, I worked it out with one of my assistants. I could do up to 400 projects in a year. I mean, that's ridiculous. When you're sort of cutting, you guys know, when you're just sort of cutting records, you're just at it, and you start adding up how many projects you're doing. It's absolutely terrifying. It's scary. You start multiplying that by sort of nearly 30 years. I mean, it's. So you tend to get to a point of remembering the ones that were more of a challenge, maybe the ones that pushed you through to another level with your learning. I find I'm still learning so much, like Darcy said yesterday. I mean, for me, it was a 10-year learning to become, in a sense, a junior mastering engineer was 10 years. This model of people coming out and going, oh, I'm a mastering engineer, with no training, without being around people, without understanding, without having mentors around them, to help them through the journey. I mean, it's hard now because we don't have the big studio complexes. So, people like Darcy, myself, a lot of, male master engineers, we will mentor and always be there. People know that we're in the background. If they hit shit, they know that they've got somebody they can go to and go, look, I've got this problem, what would you do? Or collectives of people, like you guys, you're very close, so you have issues, you can talk about it. You've got other people you can reach out to. It's this, the forum thing's a great idea. When I came into the industry, Sean, I remember, these days, and this was right at the beginning of my training, the master engineers used to go to the coast together. I remember getting on a coach with everyone, and they'd go on jollies, for a day where they'd all get drunk and hang out, and, there was this, sort of team spirit, and we feel like we're all in competition. We're not really in competition. People are going to come to me based on my ears, That's what they want. There's no competition. I have competitors that will email my clients every week for a year and call them up to ask, them to do a free tryout. And it's just like, why bother? Why bother? There's loads of work out there. Go find your work. My clients didn't go. They just thought it was a joke. But why bother? There's loads of work. Find your work. People come to me based on my ears. That's it. You're not my competition. You don't hear the way I hear. Don't hustle. Other people. I just find it weird. It's a weird sort of mentality to me. This sort of cutthroat thing. There's lots of work out there. People are desperate for our skills, I think. I mean, I can't keep up with the workload I've got. I'll get emails every day people asking to work with me. There's loads of work. So yeah. I think there isn't competition in that sense.
Wicked. So my last question, how did you get the name for your studio?
So Sean came and he sourced me my lathe, my VMS 70, and it was the first day that we actually did a cut on my lathe, and Sean was there telling me a story about his classic car, his Lee Francis classic car that he'd managed to get working, but he didn't have a seat in it, a driver's seat. So he put some boxes in the seat, and off he went. He lives out in the most beautiful part of England, out in the countryside, and he took it out for a drive. And he calls it's a convertible, Lee Francis, he calls it his Black Saloon. So that's where the name of the studio came from. It was in honour of one of my teachers.
Amazing.
So, yeah. So I was going to ask Sean some questions because it's quite interesting seeing these sort of generations of people, and Sean being, one of my teachers. So, Sean, you've seen many changes.
Yes, indeed.
Over the years in mastering. What was it like when you started?
Well, I started, and if you go out the door of here and you turn left and you go past BBC, you go down Portland Place, and at number 35 you can see on the first floor separate glazing on the veranda, because that was Radio Normandy's studios. Radio Normandy was a commercial radio station like Luxembourg before the war, and their studios were down 35 Portland Place, International Broadcasting Company, IBC. And after the war, the transmitter didn't reopen in Normandy, so the studios became an independent recording studio. And that's where I started almost exactly 60 years ago, 1958. I actually joined as a member of the workshop team, but when the management found out that I had already been cutting discs at home on a British-made MSS disc cutting lathe, I also had an American Presto, which taught me a lot, because every time I wanted to cut a disc, it had to have a total overhaul. And so it was really a question of learning all of the things that can go wrong in disc cutting. Because in disc cutting, it's obviously important to know what you should do. It's equally important to know what you shouldn't do, because blowing up a cutting head is not going to make you popular with the management. And putting too many sapphire cutting styli down into the aluminium on the disc also isn't very popular. So although I joined as a member of the workshop staff, they had actually just got the first stereo Lyrac lathe in this country, and they had a mono room and a stereo room, and they only had one cutting engineer, Ray Prickett, and so once they realized that I had already some experience of disc cutting, they said, right, I could be trained up in the mono room, which I was, and luckily, because as I said, I'd learnt the mustn't do things of disc cutting. It was about, I think, 3 months, maybe 4, before I was allowed to cut masters on my own, unsupervised, and so on. And I also wanted to do recording, balancing as well, which I did get to do. Mostly stuff that the other engineers didn't want to do, like classical stuff of Julian Bream, Janet Baker, and a whole slew of Shakespeare, because none of the engineers wanted Shakespeare. So I got to work with Sir John Gielgud, Ralph Richardson, Dame Peggy Ashcroft, and practically all of the top people for an American record label called Cadmon. And they had pots of money, and they were determined to record all the plays of Shakespeare with all the top people in London on the stage. So that was fascinating. And as far as what's happening in mastering is concerned, well, yeah, it has changed a lot. In 1957, I went to 2 interviews for a job, one at Abbey Road, one at Decca, and both said the same thing to me. At Abbey Road, the manager there, Chick Fowler, said, "Whatever, if you join us, whatever you end up doing, we'll put you on disc cutting first, because you've got to know what makes a good disc." And Arthur Hadley said the same thing at Decca. I'd be put on disc cutting first, because we don't want people turning out uncuttable tapes. At that time, the principle of mastering was basically the tape should be prepared ready for issue, basically. And it had to be pretty close to the final product, because on the Lyrac lathe, we had very basic EQ, top lift and cut, bass lift and cut, and that was it. No limiters, compressors, no parametric EQ, and you could just trim the frequency response a little bit, but not by much. And the idea of having the kind of outboard gear that you'll see in a mastering room these days, it just wasn't there. The Lyrac stereo Lyrac machine did have compressors, but they were ghastly. Most of Autofon's electronics were extremely good, but their compressor limiters were really pretty dreadful. They used to pump and breathe and hiss and gasp. They sounded like somebody who's just run the London Marathon and is about to drop dead of exhaustion. This awful oof, 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 sort of everything. So they were hardly ever used. Also, the stereo machine did have the early generation of high-frequency limiting, what we'd nowadays think of as de-essing, I suppose, which worked partly well. I remember having a hell of a job cutting the Janacek Sinfonietta. I don't know if anybody knows that piece of music. It was the first recording made by the British conductor who championed Janacek very much. Any names? Any ideas? Anyway, in the last movement of the Sinfonietta, there's a orchestral phrase, ba 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 ba, and then there are tubular bells going ding 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 ding, and the valve cutting amps just went click 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 click, clipping like mad. And so I thought, how the hell am I going to get around this? So it was a question of a quick drop in level plus a bit of high frequency cutoff, which you had to just be really quick, where it was happening, so that you didn't ruin the rest of the track. So yeah, in out, and that was it.
Yeah, them skills are getting lost a little bit. I forgot about that. That live cutting where you had to do all the changes.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I remember that.
Yes.
We done one recently, Doug, didn't we? Yeah, wherever you are, yeah.
Yeah, when
that was a bit like, whoa, what's this?
Yeah. Well, when I set up Strawberry Mastering, which was mentioned earlier on today, I didn't cut that Australian master, the sunny part. But at Strawberry Mastering, I designed the control desk and installed the lathe and everything else. I had 2 complete sets of EQ and limiters, and one changeover switch would change over from bank A to bank B. So you could preset each track on an album. If you had different EQ settings for the different tracks, you could be presetting the one for the next track, and then you just simply switch over and you've got the alternative channel. And that was really quite useful, because if you went through, I mean, very often, of course, when you've got an album, the producer may be hearing the whole thing complete for the first time for a long time, because they've been working on track by track. And then certain things come up like, oh, that track can't follow that one easily because it's such a different spectrum. So you could then, as I say, set up your pre-EQ and flick over, because you'd need to be an octopus on speed to be able to do all the other EQ settings if you only had the 5 seconds gap between tracks to do it in.
So what do you think about today with all this streaming and all this?
Well,
where we are now.
I am, shall we say, I wouldn't quite call myself a Luddite, but as far as I'm concerned, it's another world, and I will admit that old age has caught up with me, and I am what you might call sonically conservative. I consider, I just think, make a decent recording in the first place, and you don't have to about for the rest of your life to get it to sound right for whatever. And as for cardboard music, which is what I call MP3,
Agreed. So you must remember, Sean, when we started coming into the Loudness with all the CD mastering.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, it's quite sick that, you know, it's still going on, as we know.
Yeah.
But yeah, what...
Well, I have a friend, a previous client, he's closed his room down now in Belgium, Paul van der Jonkheid, had a studio called Foon, and he once said something which I've always remembered and I think is well worth remembering about disc cutting, analog disc. He said, what a cutting head doesn't like, the ear doesn't like. And it's pretty well true. You know, the trouble with CD, of course, is that if you want to go really stupid and put plus 8 dBs at 16 kilohertz, you can do it. The CD format allows you to do it. Just because you can do it doesn't mean to say you should do it. And I think that should be put up on the on the wall of every mastering room, particularly when they're working in digital. Yeah. And also, I don't think 98% of recording producers and possibly artists have never heard of the Fletcher-Munson curves. And I'm afraid quite a few mastering engineers may not also. Now, the Harvey Fletcher and I can't remember Munson's first name, I think they were Yale. Anybody know whether they were Yale or Harvard? Uh-huh.
Bell Labs?
Sorry?
Is it Bell Labs?
At Harvard, they were at Harvard, yeah.
Harvard, yeah. Well, they produce the curves of the ear's sensitivity. We don't have a flat frequency response in our ears, no matter how young, fit, and enthusiastic we are. We don't hear all frequencies equally. It's largely down, as somebody was saying just yesterday, down to evolution. You know, you get sensitive to certain frequency areas, such as the snapping of a twig, rustling of leaves as a person or an animal is looking to pounce on you. And so the mid frequencies, from about 500 hertz up to about 4K, we are most sensitive to. But here comes the difficult one, the curve showing how sensitive we are changes with the level of the signal, so that at high levels, around 100 dB, we are moderately flat. We roll off a bit in the high top and a bit in the low bass. As you go down the overall level scale, we get much less sensitive to the highs and the lows, and more sensitive, relatively speaking, to the mids. Now, various people have over the years tried to incorporate a compensating mechanism in amplifiers so that they had what they called physiological level control, where the volume control doesn't just control the volume to the speaker, but also changes the frequency response. Generally speaking, it doesn't work. It mostly it makes the sound at lower levels too tubby and screechy. When RCA introduced their Dynagroove system, which I mentioned briefly yesterday, in 1964, they also incorporated the level compensation of frequencies into the cut, which, as I say, it partly worked, but they also tried to pre-distort the disc to compensate for the playback losses, which was great if you only had a spherical stylus, but if you had a better cartridge with an elliptical stylus, it actually made it sound worse. So again, seemed like a good idea at the time. Then, of course, there were other mastering weirdos, like...
We're all weirdos, Sean.
Yeah.
Look what we do.
I don't just mean the people, but CBS Labs in Stanford, in America, produced some good ideas, but they produced some naff ideas like SQ, quadraphonic, which really wasn't a good idea. I got the inside story of that from a friend of mine who worked at the studios, that at that time, CBS was closely associated with Sony, although Sony hadn't bought CBS at the time. But what was done was that Sony got newsletters from CBS Labs of what they had been doing. Anyway, CBS Labs had worked on this SQ system of matrixing additional, so we got 4-channel matrixed into 2-channel disc cut. And Ben Bauer was the boss of CBS Labs at the time, and a very clever man, but unfortunately, what he said was, look, we've tried this, it doesn't really work very well. At center back, there was a cancellation. You couldn't put a signal at center rare on the SQ. And the isolation between channels was in areas only 3 dBs. Okay, that's half the power, but it still wasn't good enough to be called, proper 4 channels. And anyway, they said, we're not going to proceed with this idea. Sony got wind of it from the reports and said, right, this is loads and loads of extra hardware. We're going to make loads and loads of extra special players, amplifiers, speakers. So they said to CBS, here's a blank check, bring it to market. And unfortunately, Ben Bauer, who should have said, if you do that, I'll quit, he didn't quit. And they did bring it to market. Of course, it failed, not only because it was inherently imperfect, but because, of course, there was a rival system, JVC's 4-channel so-called CD4, which has nothing to do with compact discs. It was a high-frequency coded signal with a special cartridge to play these discs, which had a carrier frequency at 35 kilohertz. Autophon made a special cutting head to do these. So you needed a special cartridge, but if you played one of the CD4 quad records with an ordinary cartridge, it would probably wipe out the 35 kilohertz signal altogether. So you'd actually end up with a conventional stereo record, having paid all that much more. Anyway, the public gave the deserved raspberry to 2 incompatible systems with incompatible hardware, and this idea of we'll fight it out in the marketplace. Anyway, Quad died the death that we could have expected.
Hey-ho. So, has anyone got any questions? Maybe we should set it up for some questions.
That's great to hear, Sean. When you set up Strawberry Mastering, was this the first independent disc cutting facility in London? And what year was it?
Well, no, Strawberry wasn't the first independent, I think. Was the Exchange the first independent, do you think? No, well, I mean, IBC, of course, had mono and stereo lathes. And around about 1960, I suppose, it was possible for record labels to have their discs cut outside the majors. Up until about then, or in the mid-50s, if you wanted a record made, produced, you had to go to either EMI or Decca, and they would do the cutting, the galvanic, and the pressing for you. But around about, I suppose, 57, 58, the situation changed that independent cutting rooms sprung up, and a record company, like, for instance, there was a company called Vox Records, basically an American company. They made headlines by being the first company to get Beethoven's Ninth Symphony on one LP. And I thought, oh, wow, that must be a clever bit of cutting. Well, it wasn't really all that clever, because it was cut fixed pitch. which means that you don't have the control of groove spacing to allow for the dynamics of the music signal. Fixed pitch with a Fairchild limiter, making sure that whatever Beethoven wrote, it stayed within fairly close dynamic limits. But for Vox, 25 minutes was a short side. And I used to dread the first Monday of the month because it would be a Vox day, and I'd get, 28 minutes, 30 minutes, 35 minutes to get on one LP side. And problem in those days was trying to get lacquer discs, blank discs that were flat enough.
Still got that problem.
Yeah.
At times. Yeah.
Yes, because for such a long side, you can't cut very deep, and if the disc isn't flat, then of course you get groove depth changing, which means you've got a bit of deep groove and then no groove at all. So I used to have to go through a tin of 25 master lacquers. Sometimes I'd only get 2 or 3 that were flat enough for the long sides, which is why I didn't like the first Monday of each month. I remember once...
Hold on, we got another question.
Sorry, yeah.
Sorry, this is for Mandy, really. Are you able to switch off when you go home? Do you listen to music when you go home, or do you try and avoid it and keep the quiet space?
It depends. Music's my love. So I love listening to music. It depends. I probably wouldn't listen when I go home. I probably listen more in the morning. Sometimes I do. It really depends on my mood. I will listen to music on my days off. I do love going out and hearing music. So,
You're still listening to Wagner?
Yeah,
You
I
recently discovered Wagner.
Yeah, I like a bit of Wagner.
Well, that can write off. That can write off a month very easily, can't it?
I like listening to Iggy Pop as well.
Oh, right, yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you found it, Mandy, but I used to find that if I'd had a week of classical cutting, I looked forward to some rock. And if I'd had a week of rock, I'd look forward to some classical.
Yeah. And when I was at the Exchange and I was doing all them bagging 12s, I listened to a lot of world music just because it was so different to anything I was listening to then. Because it was, that was... I can't even believe how hard we worked there when I look back. Mm-hmm.
I can't believe how, as you mentioned, how hard it was to get the damn room plugged up and working. I mean, talk about impedance matching and level matching. It was all over the place. When Graham had great ears, and so does Mandy, had then and does now. But as I say, the time taken, inverted commas, lost by having to try and get the damn room to work at all was really quite ridiculous.
Another question?
Sean, you mentioned to me, we had a little discussion, you talked about doing multiple cuts of the same record for various reasons. And I also wondered if, Mandy, if you ever have to do that at first, but I wondered if you could just elaborate on that a little bit.
Well, you see, this was mostly with the band Yes that I used to work with. And you see, the way it worked in those days, we're talking about reel-to-reel tape days, was that generally speaking, the record company originating the recording and the country in which it was recorded would cut the masters from the original master tape, and then for release in other territories, copy tapes would be made and sent across to the other territories. Well, the band Yes decided that because they'd noticed that some of their albums were pressed overseas from cuts that had been done overseas and which didn't match the quality of the British cuts. So they decided, Chris Squire, the bass player, I found, by the way, that in most rock bands, the bass player is the most techie person in the band. I don't know why that is.
There's a lot of mastering engineers that are bass players or were bass players. Yeah. Look.
Right, yes. Yes, and then there was, I'm trying to remember, that's the problem with old age, you forget everybody's names. In King Crimson, John Wetton was bass in King Crimson when I did their cuts, and yeah, he was the techie man who, and Chris Squire would attend the cuts of Yes and decide what was wanted. And anyway, they decided that because they'd had some pretty lousy cuts from overseas territories, and so they decided that they wanted all the releases in every territory to be from the same master tape and cut at the same place by me in London. So this meant that I ended up having to cut 36 sets of lacquers for the Yes albums. It also revealed how lousy the vari-groove control system was on the VMS 70 at the time of Neumann's. I'm afraid they didn't do a good job on that pitch control, because I'd get a collision on one cut, and the next cut I would do to avoid that collision, I'd open it up a bit there, and there'd be a collision somewhere else. A really, really unpredictable system. And if there's one thing that any engineer will tell you, the one thing you don't want from your gear is surprises. You know, you want to be able to say, well, if I set this thing up the way I did before, it'll do what it did again. You don't want to say, oh, well, maybe this time it's going to collide there, and maybe it'll ruin the last track or whatever. So anyway, it was quite a job, and then I had to QC 36 sets of test pressings.
I would have quit. Wow.
A little bit esoteric. I'm just curious, did you do any coarse groove work? And if you did, how was the transition to microgroove from coarse groove, from 78 to...
Oh yes, well, I was cutting 78s. I'm a member of a weird outfit called the CLPGS, the City of London Phonograph and Gramophone Society, who get all hot under the, all get all excited and quite obscenely stoked up by criminally unfunny music hall songs on acoustic cylinders. Now, I frankly find that absolutely boring. But, anyway, they had a meeting only last week about the last days of 78s, and when I started in 58, many of the record companies were still doing pop 78s. Classical 78s had stopped by then, but I remember cutting a song called Only 16 by Craig Douglas for Top Rank Records. I got the whole contract of Top Rank by cutting that one because it had been cut elsewhere in another London cutting room and it jumped. So I got the whole Top Rank label from that one. And there were people like Petula Clark and Lonnie Donegan. They were on Pi and they were all on 78. And so were a lot of the American labels, things like the Platters on Mercury. We cut Mercury 78s. These were all pressed on a filled vinyl, which was a very good mixture because it had lower surface noise than the shellac. It wasn't as breakable, but could stand an acoustic gramophone playback without collapsing. Later on, I tried to find the same formula when I made an acoustic 78 for EMI of Roberto Alagna, the top tenor at the time. It was the centenary of his master's voice, 1997. So we recorded Alagna and Tony Papano on piano. He's now the director of the Royal Opera House here. And it was to sort of replicate the famous Caruso recordings, which made the gramophone a success, really, and vice versa. The gramophone made Caruso a success. Anyway, we tried to replicate that vinyl that Pi Records had. I couldn't find anybody who had the formula. Everybody had died. And we spent £400 at Sheffield University to do an analysis of one of the Pi records I'd still got. They said, it's a polyvinyl chloride with fillers. Well, we knew that. And with a colleague in Sheffield who was a good chemist, industrial chemist, we managed to get a mixture. It broke the extruder on EMI's manual press at Hayes, but even so, they managed to press 1,500 copies of this record, which is quite a rare record now. It was pressed in two styles, one with His Master's Voice label for England, and the other with the Recording Angel for America, because Victor Records in America still have the copyright on the His Master's Voice trademark. So we couldn't, they can't be exported from here to America. Yeah, so 70, well, what we did with the Lyrac mono lathe, when you press the 78 turntable speed button, the equalization in the cutting amp went over from RIAA to the European DIN and British standard coarse groove curve, which is 50 microseconds in the top as against the 75, and 415 as opposed to 318 in the bass. We didn't change the cutting stylus, we just used the same as the LP, but went deeper. So the top width of the groove was 150 microns as opposed to 70 for a normal LP.
Wow, fascinating. Thank you, Sean. That was amazing.